Hello, everyone. Welcome back to part 3 of the home buying timeline. My name is Mac. I'm the son.
And I'm Becca, the mom.
Last episode, we were able to discuss house hunting and making an offer on your dream home. And today we get to just talk briefly about concessions on this short episode. So, Mom, let's just jump into it. What really are concessions? Because obviously that's a term I've never really heard in real estate frequently. So what would you explain concessions are?
Concessions are, in simplest terms, are usually just a concession that the seller offers the buyer so that the buyer doesn't have to bring so much cash in to close. And it comes in super helpful, especially for a buyer who doesn't have a ton of money to put down or to add, like closing costs or any other concessions that they might need.
So with closing costs, like that's entailed within concessions?
Yeah, so closing costs are super confusing to a lot of people. Whenever I talk to, especially first-time home buyers, they don't understand closing costs. What are those?
Yeah.
Closing costs are essentially the fees that you need to close on your loan and to also close at the title company. And so there's some fees that are associated with your loan, and there's fees associated with your closing at a title company.
And is that something that the realtor should disclose, or the title company or the loan should disclose when you're, looking into buying a home? You've made an offer and you're about to purchase your home.
That's such a great question. It's usually done through the lender when they give you like their first estimate of what it's going to cost for you to close on a loan with them. That's actually where a buyer, that's why I always give the buyer a few different options for lenders, because lenders can actually compete for your business by offering different fees. So if they can offer lower fees to you, then you might want to go with them as a preferred lender.
So that's why it's important to go shopping for lenders, because their closing costs might be different from another lender's closing costs. So a buyer should never be surprised by these extra fees of closing costs when they're, when they're receiving their loan to purchase a home.
No. And if you have a good realtor, the realtor will be explaining that to you also.
Right.
Because when you do go to make an offer, if a buyer needs help, they don't have money to bring like their down payment and to pay for closing costs, then that's a conversation we need to have prior to the offer so that we know what we need to ask in concessions from the seller.
What are some other things that are entailed within these fees that people may not always think of when purchasing a home? Because obviously working with a realtor, there's commissions involved as well.
Yeah, 100%. And this gets a little bit tricky because a lot of realtors don't explain this very well. As a matter of fact, we had a huge lawsuit last year, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in another episode. But we had a huge lawsuit last year where in August, it changed that the listing agents and the MLS are no longer able to disclose what commissions for the buyer's agent the seller is willing to pay. So because that's no longer disclosed, it now has to be asked for in the offer. So back in the day, before 2024 August, when we would pull up a data sheet on the MLS as a realtor, the buyer can't see it, but the realtors can see what the seller's willing to offer for commissions. It always has been asked for, but always assumed because it was disclosed. If the listing agent disclosed that the seller was willing to pay 3%, then it was just assumed that they would get 3% when they closed on the home. But now it has to be asked for in the offer. But it's actually the buyer's responsibility to pay their realtor's commission, unless it's asked for from the seller. Just like your closing costs with the lender. If you can bring your own closing costs, you don't have to ask the seller for it.
Gotcha.
If you can pay your own commissions, you don't have to ask the seller for it.
So the seller is the one who's paying the commissions, not the, or does it go from both sides?
It goes from both sides.
Okay,
so the seller pays the listing agent.
Gotcha.
The buyer pays the buyer's agent. Under contract, that's what their contracts say. However, lots of times the seller is educated by their listing agent.
Right.
And the listing agent says, you will most likely be asked for commissions from the buyer to pay for their buyer's agent's commissions.
Oh, so the buyer doesn't have to pay for the fee because they're purchasing the seller's home.
Well, they're still obligated to pay for the fee. They're requesting
right,
the seller
right.
pay for their fees.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's something
Just
that
like they're
frequently
asking.
happens.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I would say 100%. When you make an offer, you are always, I have never not asked the seller to pay for the buyer's commissions.
And how frequently does it get denied?
I would never say it gets denied. I've never had it get denied. I've had it get negotiated.
Okay, gotcha.
So if I'm asking for 3% for my buyer and say, hey, we're requesting that you pay the commission, my commission for the buyer, because the buyer is obligated to pay my commission.
Right.
But the buyer's asking the seller to pay for it. If I ask for 3%, sometimes they send back on a counter offer, they're willing to pay 2.5% or 2%. And if that's okay with my buyer, then great. If that's okay with me and my buyer, that I'm just getting that from the seller, that's okay. But lots of times I'll negotiate. If the seller's only willing to pay that 2.5%,
they have to make up the rest.
The buyer will make up the rest.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense.
And 3% is just an example. 2% is just an example. 1% is just an example. The fees will vary depending on what you're offering to the seller and what you have agreed on with the buyer through your contract.
So it's between you and the seller, or
it's between you and the buyer, or you and the seller as a realtor.
Okay,
yes.
Gotcha. So along with these closing costs and the commissions that are received, is there anything else within these fees that buyers and sellers should be aware of within the home buying timeline?
I don't think there's any other like closing costs or commissions or anything that we haven't already discussed. But there are some other concessions that the seller can offer. And sometimes it's like the fun stuff, like things like if you go through a home and it has really old carpet, and you know that you wouldn't want to live in that home unless it had newer carpet, we actually could ask the seller to give us a carpet allowance or to replace the carpet prior to closing. So those are some things that we can ask for. There's also some inspection items. If we'd go through the inspection and there's actually some things that come up in the inspection, like it needs a new roof or it needs new paint or it needs, just stuff like that. Safety issues, you can ask the seller for concessions to either fix those or to provide financial help to fix those once they're closed.
Gotcha. So those things would be like referred to as an allowance? Okay, so you can receive...
Sometimes. Yeah. It's not always a concession, but we'll ask for, that's just some verbiage that we'll use, but it's essentially a concession.
And are those things just essentially equated by knocking off the price of the house?
Sometimes we knock off the price. But for instance, if you have zero money as a new home buyer, you just have barely enough for your down payment, and you have to ask the seller to pay your closing costs, your buyer's agent commissions, your anything else that you need to have them ask because you don't have any other money to bring to the table. Coming off the purchase price isn't going to help you for new carpet. You're going to have to ask them for money.
Gotcha.
To come back to you in some way or to go to the carpet company. We can't write a check. The seller can't write a check to the buyer, but they can write a check to the carpet company.
Oh, okay.
And you can go to the carpet company and pick out your carpet and then they can install it.
Gotcha. Everyone, thank you so much for listening to part 3, talking and discussing about concessions and what's all entailed within that. We'll see you next episode.